Eleanor Blake stood at the altar with her heart pounding, and the moment the church doors opened, something felt wrong. The guests were whispering. Her hands trembled inside her white gloves. She looked down the aisle expecting to see Duke Nathaniel Cross walking toward her with pride in his eyes, the way he had promised her every night for the past 6 months. Instead, she saw him standing perfectly still near the altar, his gaze fixed not on her, but on someone behind her. Eleanor turned her head slowly, and her stomach dropped. Her younger half-sister, Camille Blake, was standing there in a pale blue dress, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her chest, as though she could barely breathe. The priest cleared his throat, unsure of what was happening. The silence in the church grew heavy, pressing down on Eleanor's shoulders like a physical weight. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice steady despite the chaos rising around him. "I cannot marry you, Eleanor," he said. "I have realized, in these final days, that it is Camille I love. It has always been Camille." The words hit Eleanor like cold water thrown across her face. She felt her knees weaken, but she refused to fall. Around her, gasps rippled through the crowd. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth. Her father rose halfway from his seat, uncertain whether to intervene or stay frozen in shock. Eleanor's eyes moved from Nathaniel to Camille, searching for some explanation, some sign that this was a terrible joke. But Camille would not meet her eyes. She stared at the floor, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. Eleanor's mind raced back through the months of their courtship. She remembered the quiet mornings when Nathaniel would visit her at her family's estate, bringing fresh flowers picked from his own garden. She remembered the letters he wrote her when he traveled, filled with promises of forever. She remembered the private moments they shared, moments so intimate that she had believed, without a single doubt, that Nathaniel belonged to her and she to him. None of that seemed to matter now. None of it seemed real. "You cannot mean this," Eleanor whispered, though her voice barely carried past the first row of pews. "Nathaniel, look at me. Tell me this is not happening." But Nathaniel did not look at her. He walked past her, slow and deliberate, and reached for Camille's hand. The congregation erupted into murmurs, some scandalized, some strangely delighted by the drama unfolding before them. Eleanor stood alone at the altar, the bouquet of white roses trembling in her grip. She felt every eye in the church turn toward her, waiting to see how she would react, as though her humiliation were a performance for their entertainment. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her collapse. Eleanor lifted her chin, set her jaw, and turned to walk back down the aisle alone. Each step felt like walking through deep water, her legs heavy, her chest tight. She passed rows of familiar faces, cousins, family friends, people who had watched her grow up, and none of them moved to comfort her. They simply watched, transfixed by the unraveling scandal. Outside the church, the afternoon sun felt far too bright and far too warm for what had just happened. Eleanor stood on the stone steps, gasping for air, as though she had been underwater the entire time. Her carriage waited nearby, the horses shifting restlessly, sensing perhaps that something had gone terribly wrong. She climbed inside without waiting for anyone to open the door for her, and the moment the door shut behind her, she allowed herself to break. The tears came in violent waves, shaking her entire body. She pressed her hands over her face, trying to muffle the sound of her own sobbing, though there was no one left to hear it, except the driver up front, who wisely said nothing and simply guided the horses forward. As the carriage rolled away from the church, Eleanor caught one last glimpse through the window. Nathaniel and Camille stood together on the steps, his arm now wrapped protectively around her sister's shoulders. Camille glanced toward the carriage for just a moment, and in that brief look, Eleanor thought she saw something strange flicker across her sister's face. It was not joy. It was not triumph. It looked almost like fear. Eleanor did not have the strength to wonder what that meant, not yet. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of shame and grief. Eleanor remained in her room at her family's estate, refusing most meals, speaking to no one except when absolutely necessary. Her mother tried to comfort her, bringing warm tea and soft words, but Eleanor could not bear to be touched or consoled. Her father, a proud man who cared deeply about the family's reputation, seemed more concerned with how the scandal would affect their standing among the nobility than with his daughter's broken heart. He spoke of damage control, of statements to be released, of ways to spin the story so that Eleanor appeared dignified rather than discarded. Eleanor barely listened. She sat by her window for hours, staring out at the gardens where she and Nathaniel used to walk together. She thought of every conversation, every promise, every quiet laugh they had shared, trying to find the exact moment when his feelings had shifted toward her sister. She could not find it. As far as she could tell, there had been no warning at all. One day he had been hers, completely, and the next day he had chosen someone else, in front of everyone she knew. Word of the failed wedding spread quickly through the town and beyond. Eleanor became the subject of pity and gossip, in equal measure. Some called her unlucky. Others whispered that she must have done something to drive Nathaniel away, that a man does not simply abandon his bride at the altar without reason. The unfairness of it burned inside her, but she had no strength left to defend herself against rumors she could not control. Camille, meanwhile, avoided the family estate entirely, staying instead at a property owned by the Cross family, while preparations began for a quieter, more private wedding between her and Nathaniel. Eleanor heard about these plans through servants and distant relatives, each piece of news landing like another small wound. She wondered how her sister could move forward so easily, how she could smile for wedding portraits while Eleanor sat alone in the dark, trying to remember how to breathe properly again. It was nearly 3 weeks after the wedding, that never happened, when Eleanor first noticed something was different with her body. She had been feeling unusually tired, falling asleep earlier than she ever had before, and certain foods that once brought her comfort now made her feel ill. At first she dismissed it as the natural result of grief, of weeks spent barely eating and crying herself to sleep each night. But when a full month passed without her monthly cycle arriving, a cold, sharp realization began to take shape in her mind. She sat very still in her room one evening, doing the careful arithmetic in her head, counting back the weeks to the last time she and Nathaniel had been together in private, in the days when their engagement still felt solid, and their love still felt true. The timing matched. Eleanor pressed a hand against her stomach, her breath catching in her throat. She was carrying his child. The realization brought with it a storm of emotions she could barely process. There was fear, sharp and immediate, fear of what this would mean for her reputation, for her family, for her future. There was grief all over again, because this child would be a permanent reminder of the man who had humiliated her in front of everyone she knew. And beneath all of that, quiet but undeniable, there was something else, a flicker of protectiveness, a fierce, unfamiliar instinct that told her this child, whoever they turned out to be, deserved better than to be born into scandal and shame. Eleanor did not tell anyone at first. She needed time to think, time to understand what her options truly were. She visited a physician in a nearby town under a false name, wrapped in a heavy cloak to avoid recognition, and there she received confirmation of what she already suspected. The physician, an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner, examined her carefully and delivered news that made Eleanor's breath stop entirely. "You are carrying twins," the woman said softly. "Both appear strong and healthy." Eleanor sat in stunned silence for a long moment, one hand pressed against her stomach, trying to absorb the weight of those words. Twins. 2 children, not one, both belonging to Nathaniel, both innocent of the cruelty their father had shown her. She thanked the physician quietly, paid for the visit with coins she had saved for herself, and walked back out into the cold afternoon air, feeling as though the entire world had shifted beneath her feet. As she walked, her mind turned over the possibilities one by one. If she told her family, they would likely insist she confront Nathaniel, forcing a confrontation that could destroy what remained of Camille's upcoming marriage and plunge the entire family into an even greater scandal than before. Her father, obsessed with reputation, might try to use the pregnancy as leverage, perhaps to demand money from the Cross family, or worse, to demand that Eleanor become a secret mistress arrangement to save face. Eleanor could not bear either possibility. She refused to let her children become pawns in a game of pride and power. If she told Nathaniel directly, she had no way of knowing how he would respond. Perhaps he would deny the children were his. Perhaps he would try to hide them away, ashamed of the inconvenient truth that threatened his new engagement to Camille. Or perhaps, worst of all, he would try to take the children from her entirely, using his wealth and title to claim them as his own, while discarding her, the same way he had discarded her at the altar. Eleanor had already lost her dignity in front of an entire church. She would not risk losing her children too. There was a third option, one that terrified her more than any other, yet felt like the only path that offered any real safety. She could disappear. The thought sat heavy in her mind for days, as she continued to move through her family's estate like a ghost, smiling faintly when required, speaking as little as possible, all while a plan slowly began to take shape inside her. She had a small amount of money saved from gifts and allowances over the years, money her father did not know about and could not take from her. She had skill with a needle and thread, a talent she had never taken seriously before, but one that could support a modest life somewhere far from the world she had grown up in. Eleanor began to prepare in secret. She sold a few pieces of jewelry through a trusted merchant in town, careful not to sell anything that would be noticed missing right away. She packed a small trunk with only the essentials, clothing that could be altered to disguise her condition as the months passed, along with practical items she would need to start a new life. She studied maps of the coastline, searching for a town far enough away that no one would recognize the Blake family name, yet close enough to reach without excessive travel. Each night, as she lay in bed with her hands resting over her still flat stomach, she spoke quietly to the children growing inside her. She promised them a life free of scandal, free of a father who would choose someone else over their mother, free of a family more concerned with appearances than with love. She did not know exactly how she would build that life, but she knew she had to try. The final days before her departure were the hardest. She had to behave normally around her parents, hiding the depth of what she was planning, all while her body continued its quiet transformation. She wore looser clothing, claiming the fashion suited her better during her time of grief. She ate small meals in private to avoid questions about her changing appetite. She practiced calm, steady breathing whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, knowing that any sign of distress might draw unwanted attention from her mother's watchful eyes. Eleanor chose a night when both of her parents were attending a social gathering in town, a rare evening when the household staff would be occupied elsewhere and the estate would be quieter than usual. She dressed in simple traveling clothes, nothing that would suggest wealth or status, and packed the last of her belongings into the small trunk she had prepared. Before leaving, she sat at her writing desk and composed a short letter to her parents, careful with every word. She wrote that she needed time away from the town, away from the whispers and the pity that followed her everywhere she went. She wrote that she loved them, despite everything, and asked them not to search for her, promising that she would write again when she was ready. She did not mention the children. She could not risk the letter falling into the wrong hands, could not risk her father using the information as a weapon before she had even reached safety. Eleanor sealed the letter and placed it on her pillow, where her mother would find it in the morning. Then she picked up her trunk, pulled her cloak tightly around her shoulders, and walked quietly through the halls of the only home she had ever known. She paused for a moment at the top of the staircase, looking back at the portraits lining the walls, generations of Blake family members staring down at her with painted, unmoving eyes. She thought of Camille, somewhere across town, preparing for a wedding that should have been Eleanor's own. She thought of Nathaniel, likely sleeping peacefully, unaware that the children he had created were about to disappear from his life entirely. A part of her wanted to feel guilty for keeping this secret from him, but the larger part of her, the part shaped by weeks of humiliation and heartbreak, felt only a fierce determination to protect what remained of her own life. Eleanor stepped out into the cold night air, closing the estate door softly behind her. A hired carriage waited at the edge of the property, arranged discreetly through a driver she had paid well to keep silent about her destination. As she climbed inside, and the carriage began to move, pulling her away from everything familiar, Eleanor allowed herself one final look back at the house where she had grown up. The windows were dark. No one had noticed her leaving yet. By the time anyone did, she would be far beyond their reach. As the carriage rattled along the dark road leading away from town, Eleanor rested a protective hand over her stomach and closed her eyes. She did not know exactly where her journey would take her, or how difficult the months ahead would be, but she knew one thing, with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, she would face it as a mother now, not merely as a woman who had been left behind. And for her children, she would build a life stronger and safer than the one that had been stolen from her. The road stretched on into darkness, carrying her toward a future no one back home could have imagined. 3 days of travel brought Eleanor far from everything she had ever known. The carriage rides blurred together, one town fading into the next, each stop bringing new faces that did not recognize her, new inns where no one whispered her name behind cupped hands. She had never traveled such distances alone before, and the unfamiliarity of it should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she found a strange comfort in the anonymity. For the first time since the wedding that never happened, no one looked at her with pity or curiosity. She was simply a young woman traveling, nothing more. She finally settled on a coastal town called Millbrook Bay, chosen partly because of its distance from her family's estate, and partly because something about the description in her travel guide had appealed to her. It was a modest fishing town, built along a curved harbor, where wooden boats bobbed gently against the docks each morning. The streets were lined with small shops and stone cottages, and the salty air carried the constant sound of gulls circling overhead. It was nothing like the grand estates and manicured gardens she had grown up around, and that was exactly why it felt safe. Eleanor arrived in Millbrook Bay with her trunk, her small savings, and a story she had carefully constructed during the long carriage rides. She would tell people her name was Elena Marsh, a young widow whose husband had been lost at sea before their children were born. It was a believable story, in a fishing town, where such tragedies were common, and it would explain both her unmarried status and her condition, without inviting too many uncomfortable questions. Finding lodging proved easier than she expected. A kind older woman named Margaret Doyle owned a modest boarding house near the edge of town, and something about Eleanor's quiet, careful manner seemed to earn the woman's sympathy immediately. Margaret had lost her own husband years earlier, and recognized something of her younger self in the tired, guarded eyes of the young widow standing at her door. "You'll be needing a place to settle before that baby comes," Margaret said, glancing knowingly at the way Eleanor held herself. She did not yet know it was 2 babies, not 1, but Eleanor did not correct her. The room Margaret offered was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a window that looked out toward the harbor. It was nothing like the grand bedroom Eleanor had grown up in, yet she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settling over her the moment she set down her trunk. This room was hers. No one here knew the name Blake. No one here knew about Duke Nathaniel Cross, or the humiliation she had suffered at the altar. She could simply exist, quietly and safely, as Elena Marsh. The following weeks passed in a rhythm of careful adjustment. Eleanor, now Elena, found work through Margaret's connections, taking in sewing and alteration work from the wives of local fishermen and merchants. Her skill with a needle, once considered nothing more than a proper lady's hobby, became her lifeline. She spent long hours by the window, stitching hems and repairing torn fabric, watching the boats come and go from the harbor, while her body continued to change with the growing life inside her. As the months progressed, her condition became impossible to hide, and the twins grew stronger within her. She felt their first movements late one evening, while sitting alone in her small room, a fluttering sensation deep inside that made her gasp and press both hands against her stomach in wonder. Despite everything she had lost, despite the pain still lingering from Nathaniel's betrayal, she felt something close to joy in that moment. These children were hers. Whatever else had been taken from her, this remained. Margaret became something of a mother figure during this time, checking in on Elena regularly, bringing extra food when she noticed the young woman working too hard, and sharing stories of her own difficult years as a young widow raising children alone. Elena found herself growing genuinely fond of the older woman, grateful for a kindness that asks nothing in return. The other women in town were slower to warm to the mysterious young widow who had appeared seemingly from nowhere, but Elena's quiet dignity and clear talent with needlework gradually earned their trust. She began receiving more sewing requests than she could easily manage, and soon she was able to save a small amount of money each week, enough to eventually consider renting a small shop of her own once the children were born and old enough to allow her more freedom to work. Not everything about her new life was peaceful, however. There were nights when the weight of what she had left behind pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She thought of her parents, wondering if they had searched for her, wondering how much pain her disappearance had caused them despite everything. She thought of Camille, imagining her sister now married to Nathaniel, living the life that should have belonged to Eleanor. And she thought of Nathaniel himself, wondering if he ever wondered what had become of her, or if he had simply moved on without a second thought, relieved that she had vanished so conveniently, after the humiliation he had caused. She refused to let herself dwell too long on these thoughts. Whenever the sadness threatened to overwhelm her, she would place her hands on her stomach and remind herself why she had left in the first place. These children deserved a mother who was strong, not one who spent her days drowning in grief over a man who had not cared enough to fight for her. As the final weeks of her pregnancy approached, Margaret arranged for a local midwife to check on Elena regularly, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Louisa, who had delivered nearly every child in Millbrook Bay for the past 20 years. It was during one of these visits that Louisa confirmed what Elena already suspected from the physician back home. 2 heartbeats, Louisa said, pressing her ear against Elena's stomach with practiced precision. "You're carrying twins, my dear." Even though she already knew, hearing it confirmed again in this new life, this new identity, made the reality feel more solid somehow. 2 children, a boy and a girl, as it would turn out, born on a stormy autumn evening, while wind rattled the windows of Margaret's boarding house and rain hammered against the roof. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Elena feared she might not survive it, alone in this town far from her family, with only Margaret and Louisa by her side. But she pushed through the pain with a strength she did not know she possessed, driven by the fierce need to meet the children she had sacrificed so much to protect. When it was finally over, Elena lay exhausted, but overwhelmed with a fierce, protective love, as Louisa placed first one infant, then the other, into her arms. The boy had dark hair like his father, and the girl had a softer, lighter coloring that reminded Elena of her own childhood portraits. She looked down at their small faces, still red and wrinkled from birth, and felt something inside her settle into place, as though every difficult decision she had made over the past months had led her exactly to this moment. She named the boy Henry, after her grandfather, a man who had always shown her genuine kindness during her childhood. She named the girl Grace, a name that felt fitting for the resilience it had taken to bring these children safely into the world. Neither name carried any connection to the Cross family, no reminder of the man who had chosen someone else at the altar. These children would grow up as Marsh children, free from the shadow of a scandal they had played no part in creating. The weeks following the birth were exhausting, yet filled with a quiet happiness Elena had not expected to find again. Margaret helped care for the twins whenever Elena needed rest, and the women of the town, who had grown fond of the young widow over the past months, brought gifts of blankets and small clothing, welcoming the babies into the community with genuine warmth. Elena began to believe, cautiously but sincerely, that she had built something real here in Millbrook Bay, something that could not be taken from her. She resumed her sewing work gradually, adjusting her schedule around the demands of caring for 2 infants, and eventually saved enough to rent a small shop near the center of town, where she displayed her finest work and took on a steady stream of customers. The shop became a source of quiet pride for her, proof that she could support herself and her children entirely, through her own skill and determination, without relying on the wealth or protection of any man. As Henry and Grace grew from infants into toddlers, Elena watched them carefully for signs of their father, in their features and mannerisms. Henry had Nathaniel's dark hair, and the same intense, thoughtful expression that Nathaniel used to wear when considering a difficult decision. Grace had a stubborn streak that reminded Elena uncomfortably of Camille, though she pushed that particular observation away whenever it surfaced, unwilling to dwell too long on the family she had left behind. Life in Millbrook Bay was not without its challenges. Money remained tight in the early years, and there were harsh winters when Elena worried constantly about keeping her small family warm and fed. There were moments of loneliness too, evenings when she watched other families walking together along the harbor, husbands and wives with their children, and felt keenly the absence of a partner to share the burden of raising 2 young children alone. But these difficult moments were balanced by genuine joys, first steps and first words, small victories that felt entirely her own, unclouded by scandal or shame. Margaret remained a steady presence throughout these years, growing closer to Elena and the twins with each passing season, until she felt less like a landlady and more like family. It was Margaret who taught Elena the practical skills of child-rearing that her own privileged upbringing had never required her to learn, and it was Margaret who provided the emotional support that Elena's own mother, back at the Blake estate, was unable to offer from such a distance. Occasionally, news from the wider world would filter into Millbrook Bay through traveling merchants or newspapers that arrived on the fishing boats. Elena remained cautiously alert for any mention of the Blake or Cross families, terrified, yet strangely compelled to learn what had become of the life she left behind. She learned, through fragments of gossip passed between customers in her shop, that Duke Nathaniel Cross had indeed married Camille Blake, in a quiet ceremony, shortly after the scandal of the failed wedding had faded from public conversation. She learned nothing more specific than that, and she told herself it was better this way. She had built a new life. She did not need to know the details of the old one. Yet despite her best efforts to move forward, a part of Elena remained tethered to the past, wondering occasionally what might have happened if she had stayed and confronted Nathaniel directly, wondering if the truth of Camille's involvement in the betrayal was more complicated than it appeared on that terrible wedding day. These thoughts surfaced rarely, pushed quickly aside by the demands of daily life, but they never fully disappeared. As Henry and Grace grew older, developing distinct personalities and interests, Elena found herself falling deeper in love with the family she had built, however unconventional its origins. She taught them to read using books borrowed from neighbors, taught them basic arithmetic using coins from her shop's earnings, and taught them, above all else, the value of honesty and hard work, lessons she herself had learned the hard way. Millbrook Bay had become home in every sense that mattered. Elena Marsh, once Eleanor Blake, had transformed her deepest heartbreak into a foundation of quiet strength, raising two remarkable children entirely on her own terms, far from the world that had once tried to define her only by the humiliation she had suffered. She believed, with growing confidence, that this chapter of running and hiding was finally behind her. She had no way of knowing that back at the Cross estate, cracks were already beginning to form in the marriage between Nathaniel and Camille, cracks that would eventually lead to questions neither of them could avoid forever. Nathaniel Cross sat alone in his study late one evening, staring at a letter he had received earlier that day from a business associate who had traveled through several coastal towns on trading matters. The letter itself contained nothing unusual, simply routine correspondence about shipping arrangements. But a single line near the end had caught his attention and refused to let go. The associate mentioned, almost as an afterthought, encountering a talented seamstress in a small fishing town who bore a striking resemblance to a woman Nathaniel had once known. He told himself it was nothing. Coincidences happened constantly, and there was no reason to believe this mysterious seamstress had any connection to Eleanor Blake, the woman who had disappeared without explanation years earlier. Yet something about the description lingered in his mind throughout the following days, refusing to be dismissed entirely. His marriage to Camille had grown increasingly strained over the years since their wedding. What had once seemed like an intense, undeniable connection had gradually revealed itself to be something far more complicated and troubling. Camille had proven herself capable of manipulation on a scale Nathaniel had never anticipated when he first fell under her spell. Small inconsistencies in her stories, contradictions in details she had once sworn were true, had slowly accumulated over the years until Nathaniel could no longer ignore the growing unease in his chest whenever he looked at his wife. It had started subtly. A servant mentioned overhearing Camille speaking with someone about finally getting what she deserved shortly after the wedding. That never happened. Nathaniel had dismissed it at the time, assuming the comment referred to something innocent. But other small clues followed over the years. Comments from relatives, half-finished sentences from Camille herself during moments of distraction, that suggested her feelings for Nathaniel had been calculated rather than spontaneous, planned rather than the sudden overwhelming love she had claimed to feel on his wedding day to Eleanor. Nathaniel began quietly investigating his own memories of that fateful day, trying to reconstruct exactly what had happened and why. He remembered feeling an inexplicable, overwhelming certainty in the days leading up to the wedding, a certainty that had felt entirely genuine at the time, but which now, in hindsight, felt strangely disconnected from his actual feelings for Eleanor, feelings he now recognized had been real and deep before that certainty had somehow overtaken them. He began to wonder, with growing unease, whether that certainty had been entirely his own, or whether it had been carefully cultivated through subtle manipulation he had failed to recognize at the time. The tension in his marriage grew as these suspicions deepened. Camille noticed his increasing distance, his tendency to study her with a careful, searching expression that had never existed in their earlier years together. She grew defensive whenever he asked questions about the past, deflecting, or changing the subject entirely whenever he brought up the wedding day, or her feelings leading up to it. One evening, after years of growing distrust, Nathaniel confronted his wife directly, no longer willing to accept vague answers or evasive responses. He asked her plainly whether she had done anything to influence his feelings toward Eleanor in the days before their original wedding. Camille's reaction confirmed his worst suspicions before she even spoke a single word. Her face drained of color, her hands began to tremble, and for several long moments, she said nothing at all, simply staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between fear and resignation. When she finally spoke, the truth spilled out in fragments, incomplete confessions mixed with desperate justifications. She admitted, through tears that Nathaniel could no longer be certain were genuine, that she had indeed manipulated the situation, using a combination of persuasive conversations and carefully timed influence to shift Nathaniel's affections away from Eleanor and toward herself. In the final weeks before the original wedding, she had been envious of her sister for years, she explained, tired of living in Eleanor's shadow, tired of watching her sister receive attention and affection that Camille felt she deserved more. Nathaniel listened in stunned silence as the full scope of the deception became clear. Camille had not simply fallen in love with him unexpectedly, as she had always claimed. She had deliberately set out to take him from her sister, using every tool available to her, including subtle suggestions planted in conversations with Nathaniel's own family members, designed to make him question his feelings for Eleanor at the exact moment when doubt would be most effective. The revelation shattered whatever remained of Nathaniel's trust in his marriage. He felt a wave of guilt so overwhelming it nearly brought him to his knees. Guilt over the pain he had caused Eleanor. Guilt over the years he had spent married to a woman who had built their entire relationship on a foundation of deception and manipulation. He thought of Eleanor standing alone at the altar, humiliated in front of everyone she knew, and felt sick with the realization that her suffering had been entirely unnecessary, entirely the result of Camille's calculated cruelty. In the days following this confrontation, Nathaniel found himself unable to look at Camille without seeing the full weight of what she had done. Their marriage, already strained, deteriorated rapidly as trust completely collapsed between them. Nathaniel began sleeping in a separate wing of the estate, unable to bear sharing a bed with a woman whose affections had been built on such calculated betrayal. It was during this period of personal crisis that the letter mentioning the mysterious seamstress in the coastal town resurfaced in Nathaniel's mind with renewed significance. If Eleanor truly was alive somewhere, living under a different identity, he owed her more than a simple apology. He owed her the truth about everything Camille had done, and he needed to understand why Eleanor had disappeared so completely in the first place, vanishing without a trace shortly after the wedding that never happened. Nathaniel began making careful inquiries, reaching out to contacts in various coastal towns, asking discreet questions about a young widow matching Eleanor's description, who might have settled in the area in the years following the scandal. Most inquiries led nowhere, dead ends that left him frustrated but unwilling to abandon the search entirely. Then, nearly 2 years after his confrontation with Camille, a response arrived from a business contact stationed near Millbrook Bay. The contact described a woman named Elena Marsh, a seamstress who had arrived in the town years earlier, claiming to be a widow, and who now raised 2 children, a boy and a girl, who would be approximately the right age if Eleanor had indeed been pregnant when she disappeared. Nathaniel's hands shook as he read the letter. 2 children. A boy and a girl. The timing aligned perfectly with the weeks before Eleanor's disappearance. Weeks that Nathaniel now remembered with painful clarity. Weeks when he and Eleanor had been intensely close before Camille's manipulation had torn them apart. He sat with this information for several days, turning over the implications in his mind. If this truly was Eleanor, and if these children truly were his own, then the guilt he already carried multiplied beyond anything he had previously imagined. Not only had he humiliated Eleanor publicly and pushed her into hiding, but he had also, entirely without his knowledge, missed years of his own children's lives, years he could never reclaim. Nathaniel made the decision to travel to Millbrook Bay personally, rather than send an intermediary. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes, needed to face Eleanor directly, and explain everything Camille had done, regardless of how painful or difficult that conversation might prove to be. He owed her that much, and he owed his children the chance to know the truth about their origins, whatever consequences that truth might bring. Before departing, He confronted Camille one final time, informing her of his intention to travel to Millbrook Bay and confirm the identity of the mysterious seamstress. Camille's reaction was a mixture of panic and desperate pleading, begging Nathaniel not to pursue the matter further, insisting that whatever had happened between them should remain buried in the past. Her desperation only confirmed what Nathaniel already suspected, that she feared the consequences of her deception being fully exposed. He left the estate without providing Camille any reassurance, his mind entirely focused on the journey ahead and the difficult conversation that awaited him in the small coastal town where Eleanor, if it truly was her, had rebuilt an entire life from the ruins he had unknowingly left behind. The journey to Millbrook Bay took several days, each mile bringing Nathaniel closer to answers he both desperately needed and deeply feared. He rehearsed different versions of what he might say, different ways of explaining Camille's manipulation, different approaches to asking forgiveness for a betrayal that, even though orchestrated by someone else, had still been carried out through his own actions and his own words spoken at that terrible altar years earlier. As his carriage finally rolled into the small fishing town, Nathaniel felt a mixture of anticipation and dread settling heavily in his chest. He had no idea what he would find, no idea how Eleanor, if it truly was her, would react to his sudden appearance after years of silence. He only knew that he could not continue living with the uncertainty, could not continue carrying the guilt of what he had done, without at least attempting to make things right. He began asking discreet questions around town, following the trail that eventually led him toward a small shop near the center of Millbrook Bay, a shop known throughout the community for producing the finest needlework in the region. As he approached the shop's entrance, his heart pounding with an intensity he had not felt in years, Nathaniel caught a glimpse through the window of a woman, bent over a piece of fabric, her dark hair pulled back in a simple, practical style, her expression focused entirely on her work. Even after years apart, even with the passage of time and the changes it had brought, Nathaniel recognized her instantly. It was Eleanor. He stood frozen outside the shop for several long moments, overwhelmed by the reality of finally finding her after so long, uncertain how to even begin the conversation that would need to follow. Through the window, he noticed two small children playing quietly in the corner of the shop, a boy with dark hair bent over some kind of wooden toy, and a girl with a determined expression on her face, both clearly around the right age to be the twins mentioned in his contact's letter. His children. His son and daughter, growing up in this small coastal town, without ever knowing their true father, without ever knowing the truth about the deception that had separated them before they were even born. Nathaniel took a deep breath, steadying himself as best he could, and stepped forward to open the shop door. The small bell above the entrance rang softly, announcing his arrival. Eleanor looked up from her work, and for one suspended moment, their eyes met across the small shop. Years of separation and pain and unanswered questions passing silently between them. Her expression shifted rapidly from confusion to shock, and then to something far more complicated, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and something else Nathaniel could not quite identify. She rose slowly from her chair, her hand instinctively reaching toward her children, as though preparing to protect them from whatever threat his sudden appearance might represent. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with years of buried emotion finally surfacing all at once. "What are you doing here?" Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, but found that all his carefully rehearsed explanations suddenly felt entirely inadequate for the moment unfolding before him. He glanced once more at the two children watching this unfamiliar man with cautious curiosity, then back at Eleanor, whose eyes now held a fierce protectiveness he had never seen from her before, a strength forged through years of hardship and sacrifice he could only begin to imagine. "I know the truth," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "About what Camille did, about everything. I have spent years searching for you, Eleanor, and I am not leaving until you hear everything I have come to say." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, but her expression remained guarded, unwilling to let years of careful self-protection crumble so easily in the face of his sudden appearance. Behind her, Henry and Grace watched the exchange with growing interest, sensing somehow that this stranger's arrival marked a significant shift in the quiet, predictable life they had known. "You have some explaining to do," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions clearly raging beneath the surface. And you had better start from the very beginning. Nathaniel nodded, closing the shop door quietly behind him, understanding that whatever happened next in this small coastal town would determine the future not only for himself and Eleanor, but for the two children who had never known the truth about their own extraordinary beginning. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, long after Margaret arrived to collect Henry and Grace for the night. Sensing that Eleanor needed privacy for whatever difficult discussion was unfolding, Nathaniel explained everything, every detail of Camille's manipulation, every subtle deception that had led him to abandon Eleanor at the altar for a love that had never been genuine on Camille's part, however real it may have briefly felt to him at the time. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression shifting through disbelief, anger, and eventually something that resembled a painful, reluctant understanding. She had spent years believing that Nathaniel had simply chosen her sister over her, that his feelings had shifted naturally and completely, leaving her discarded and humiliated through no fault but her own perceived inadequacy. Learning the truth, that his feelings had been deliberately manipulated by someone she had trusted as family, brought a complicated mixture of relief and fresh anger, relief that she had not simply been unlovable in some fundamental way, and anger at the years of unnecessary suffering Camille's cruelty had caused. "You still left me at the altar," Eleanor said finally, her voice sharp with years of accumulated pain. "Whatever Camille did, you made the choice to walk away from me in front of everyone. You made the choice to marry her afterward, to build an entire life with her, while I was forced to disappear, to raise our children entirely alone, without any support, without any knowledge that you even suspected the truth." Nathaniel accepted this accusation without argument, understanding that no explanation, however detailed, could fully excuse the pain his actions had caused. He had been deceived, but he had also failed to question his own sudden shift in feelings closely enough, failed to recognize the signs of manipulation, until years of damage had already been done. "I cannot undo what happened," he said quietly, "but I am here now, and I want to make things right, however long that process takes. I want to know my children, Eleanor. I want to be part of their lives, and I want to support you in whatever way you need, without any expectation of anything in return." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of insincerity, any suggestion that this sudden appearance was simply another manipulation, designed to serve his own interests rather than genuine remorse and desire for reconciliation. What she found instead was a man who appeared genuinely changed by years of guilt and searching, a man who had traveled a great distance not to reclaim what he felt entitled to, but to finally take responsibility for the pain his actions had caused. The following weeks brought a careful, cautious rebuilding of trust between them. Nathaniel remained in Millbrook Bay, taking modest lodging at Margaret's boarding house, rather than presuming any immediate welcome into Eleanor's home. He spent time getting to know Henry and Grace, slowly, allowing the children to warm to him naturally, rather than forcing an immediate connection they were not prepared to accept. Eleanor watched this process unfold with a complicated mixture of hope and lingering wariness. She had built an entire life for herself and her children without any reliance on Nathaniel or his wealth and status, and she was determined not to sacrifice the independence and strength she had worked so hard to develop, regardless of how genuine his remorse appeared to be. Word eventually reached the Blake estate that Eleanor had been found, alive and well, raising two children in a small coastal town. Her parents, who had spent years wondering what had become of their eldest daughter, traveled to Millbrook Bay themselves, bringing with them a complicated mixture of relief, joy, and unresolved tension regarding the circumstances that had driven Eleanor to disappear in the first place. The reunion between Eleanor and her parents was emotional and difficult, filled with explanations and apologies on both sides. Eleanor's mother wept openly upon meeting her grandchildren for the first time, while her father, initially focused on questions of reputation and family standing, gradually softened as he witnessed the genuine happiness his daughter had built for herself, despite everything she had endured. Meanwhile, news of Camille's manipulation eventually reached the wider Blake family as well, through careful, deliberate disclosure by Nathaniel, who felt it necessary for Eleanor's name to be fully cleared of any suggestion that she had somehow driven him away through her own inadequacy. The revelation of Camille's calculated deception shocked the family deeply, and Camille herself, facing the collapse of both her marriage and her reputation, retreated from public life entirely, unable to bear the consequences of choices she had made years earlier, out of jealousy and resentment toward her own sister. As months passed, Nathaniel's relationship with Henry and Grace deepened naturally, built on patience and genuine effort, rather than any presumed entitlement based on his role as their biological father. He learned Henry's quiet, thoughtful nature, recognizing in his son many of his own characteristics from childhood. He discovered Grace's fierce independence and stubborn determination, qualities that reminded him, somewhat uncomfortably yet also with growing admiration, of Eleanor's own resilience during the years of hardship she had faced alone. Eleanor, too, found herself gradually softening toward Nathaniel as she witnessed his genuine dedication to rebuilding trust, not only with his children but with her as well. He never pressured her toward any particular outcome, never suggested that she owed him forgiveness or reconciliation simply because he had traveled such a great distance to find her. Instead, he allowed the relationship to develop naturally, respecting the boundaries she established while consistently demonstrating through his actions, rather than mere words, that his remorse and his desire to make things right were entirely genuine. It was nearly a year after Nathaniel's initial arrival in Millbrook Bay that Eleanor finally allowed herself to consider what a future together might actually look like, not as a return to the naive, uncomplicated love she had once felt as a younger woman, but as a more mature, carefully considered partnership built on hard-earned respect and genuine understanding of everything they had both endured. Nathaniel formally and publicly acknowledged Henry and Grace as his legitimate children, ensuring their future security, regardless of whatever else happened between himself and Eleanor. He worked to dismantle the false narrative that Camille had constructed years earlier, ensuring that Eleanor's name and reputation were fully restored among the nobility, who had once whispered cruel rumors about her sudden disappearance. Eleanor, for her part, made clear that any future relationship between herself and Nathaniel would exist entirely on her own terms, as an equal partner rather than a woman grateful simply to be chosen again after years of rejection and hardship. She had built an independent life through her own strength and skill, and she refused to abandon that independence entirely, even as she allowed herself to consider the possibility of reconciliation with the man who had once broken her heart so completely. The people of Millbrook Bay, who had watched Elena Marsh transform from a mysterious young widow into a respected and beloved member of their community, followed the unfolding story of her true identity with fascination and genuine support. Margaret, who had become something like family over the years, expressed quiet pride in watching Eleanor navigate this complicated new chapter with the same strength and grace she had shown since first arriving in town years earlier. Eventually, Eleanor and Nathaniel chose to build a new life together, not by returning to the grand estate where the original betrayal had taken place, but by establishing a home in Millbrook Bay itself, close to the community that had supported Eleanor through her most difficult years. Nathaniel gradually transferred much of his business interests to accommodate this new life, understanding that Eleanor's happiness and independence mattered more to him than maintaining the traditional expectations of his noble title. Henry and Grace grew up knowing both the truth of their extraordinary beginning and the genuine love that eventually brought their parents back together, a love rebuilt not on naive romantic certainty, but on hard-earned trust, honesty, and mutual respect. They grew up watching their mother run her successful shop, admired throughout the region for her exceptional skill, while their father worked to ensure that the mistakes and manipulations of the past would never again threaten the family's happiness. Eleanor never forgot the pain of standing alone at that altar years earlier, never forgot the desperate months of hiding and rebuilding that had followed. But she also came to understand, through years of careful reflection, that those difficult experiences had ultimately shaped her into a woman of remarkable strength and independence, a woman who had proven, entirely through her own efforts, that she needed no one to define her worth or determine her happiness. The story of the Duke who had chosen her sister at the altar, only to find his true family years later in a small coastal town, became something of a quiet legend throughout the region, a testament to the idea that genuine love, however delayed or complicated by deception and heartbreak, could eventually find its way back to where it truly belonged. Eleanor Blake, once humiliated and abandoned, had transformed her deepest pain into an unshakable foundation of strength, ultimately choosing, on her own terms and in her own time, to give her family the chance at happiness that had once seemed impossibly lost.